Hello, this is Robert Wrigley. I'm going to read a couple of brief sections from a couple of essays from the book Nemerov's Door, a collection of essays from Tupelo Press. This first piece is the opening 2 or 3 pages from the title essay, Nemerov's Door. It has an epigraph from the great American poet Richard Hugo from his poem, Degrees of Grey in Phillipsburg. Isn't this your life? You think you might begin this story with an admission. You really don't know who you are or who you were or how you became the one after the other or the others. It's not as if you've only been 2 versions of yourself. And what does it mean to have become? How is becoming accomplished? Maybe it's about time. From time to time, there are portals you step through and become, or you don't. How much control over these things do you really have? You wonder if the self is a matter of becoming at all, or if it's just something that happens to you. How would you know the difference? But instead, you'll start with this, which is a fact. You can fix in time much of your father's history, and therefore your family's and your own, according to your memory of what car he was driving at the moment, although it isn't always easy. Once, with your mother and sister, you tried to remember all the cars he'd bought and sold. The 3 of you lost count, around 90-something. There were just too many, although you in particular had a knack for remembering details. Yellow and white 57 Mercury with a bad case of rust and push-button drive, you said, and your mother remembered. In this way, you're like your father, insofar as he too has an eye and a memory for detail, although his adoration of automobiles is not something you have come to share. If the car gets you there and back, you're fine with it. You maintain your cars mechanically, but you do not wash them very often. This has always been beyond your father's understanding. The strangest car your father ever brings home is a 1950 Dodge 2-door sedan. He bought it for $50. Someone has repainted it a hideous yellow with a brush. Your mother is speechless. But it runs good, he says. The next day, he gives it to the woman across the street whose husband has recently died. She and her daughter are without transportation. This is in 1967. It is unthinkable to him that the remnants of a family now fatherless should be without a car. None of you ever really have known the neighbor man except by sight, the occasional wave when you're coming or going. Then the neighbor man is gone for good. His daughter is the same age as you and your sister. For most of your early life, your father worked 2 jobs. The first, as a civilian employee of the Air Force. He had his own airplane once and was just a few hours shy of a pilot's license when, in 1950, his wife became pregnant with twins. He was 28, and that was the end of that. His other job was selling cars. This second job on weeknights and Saturdays brought in extra money and probably taught him a lot about socializing and making conversation. He had been a very shy young man. You gather from your mother that your father, in his young manhood, did not have a great deal of self-confidence around other people, until he did. You can understand that. You remember what that's like. In regards to selling cars, your mother knew it would be good for him being out in the world and having to talk with people he did not know. Selling cars also gave him the means to buy cars, and it turned out he was very good at both parts of that bargain. The owner of the local Mercury dealership he worked for was an old friend, like him, like every other man of your father's vintage in those days, a World War II veteran. Your father bought his cars at cost. Sometimes he'd take them back to the lot a few weeks later, having fixed them up. Often a month would pass during which there would be 3 or 4 different makes and models in the driveway in almost weekly succession. Your mother seemed occasionally irritated by it, but yet allowed his obsession. Cars were cheaper than airplanes, at least. But on the day you're remembering, your father is retired from both of those jobs. These days he builds, repairs, refinishes, restores, and reupholsters furniture in a shop in his basement. And he drives his favorite car ever, a 1975 BMW 2002. If there is another BMW in the small southern Illinois town he lives in, you've never seen it. Your father came to German cars via the Volkswagen. Your census determined that he's had at least 10 VWs, 6 Beetles, 2 Carmen Gias, a Squareback, and a Campmobile. You may have missed a couple. Should you count the Audi, you wonder? Of all these nearly unnumberable cars, the BMW is his baby. He dotes over it. He will own it for more than 2 years before it is driven in the rain. That seems a strange thing to be proud of, although he is. In some unaccountable way, so are you. And now it is you who are 28. It's 1979. You're visiting from Idaho for Christmas, and you and your father are flying down I-70 towards St. Louis at a silken 80 miles per hour. He draws your attention to the purr of the BMW's engine as you go. He always does that. You're on your way to Left Bank Books at the west end of the city, not far from the campus of Washington University. Your parents have given you a $50 gift certificate. They know you'll want poetry, and they'll leave the selection of titles to you. It's late December, a Russian front sort of day, windy and spitting occasional dry snow, mid to upper teens. Your father finds a parking place right out front. This matters. He likes being able to keep an eye on his car, and he's guessed correctly that it will take you quite a while to make your picks. You love bookstores the way your father loves car lots. You love the smell of books the way he loves the smell of a new car. There's a substantial poetry selection at Left Bank, and poetry books are especially important to you. On this day, you pick out no more than 5 volumes in all. You would have gotten more, but one of them is a thick, hard cover. The collected poems of Howard Nemerov. The book had won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award the year before, and Nemerov is a local poet. He's been teaching at Washington University for years. You admit that it's probably the awards that prompt you to buy such an expensive book, $20, since at this point you really only know one of Nemerov's poems. While you study the book poetry shelves, your father wanders the bookstore, spending most of his time in the World War II history section. He collects books about the war, especially books by Ernie Pyle or about the air war. He probably buys one today, you're not sure. He calls World War II the Good War, well before Studs Terkel's book of that title. You think he means it only a little bit, ironically. After leaving the bookstore, you cross the street to a diner for lunch, which is where you mentioned to your father that Howard Nemerov had been a pilot in the war, and that he teaches over at Wash U. This makes the poet vastly more interesting to your father, the pilot part at least, although you suspect your father too is impressed with the prizes emblazoned on the cover of Nemerov's book. Somehow, he might be thinking that this is an opportunity, some possible sidelong entry into a part of the world you mean to join, a world in which you publish books that win big prizes. He knows it's good to meet people. Sometimes they can help you. Or maybe he thinks he might play a part in helping you get there, wherever it is you're going. He might be thinking, you're aiming to be a poet, right? You think you already are. So he suggests you head over to Washington University after lunch to see if you can find the poet, Howard Nemerov. It's semester break, Dad, you say. He's not going to be on campus. You never know unless you try, he replies. You split a Reuben sandwich, and each of you has a cup of some kind of dark, rich soup with barley. Maybe there's a poster on one of the diner walls depicting Lou Brock sailing a bass, a common enough thing around St. Louis. You've been a St. Louis Cardinals fan off and on, mostly on, since your childhood. Your father, on the other hand, has never understood baseball or any other sport for that matter. He understands cars and airplanes and work. He has never seen the point of games. You wonder if poetry, too, does not seem to him a sort of game, a way of saying something by not exactly saying it at all, or by saying something else. You understand why he might think that, although you never ask him what he thinks about what you do. You know he's proud of you, although it seems that he understands your obsession no more, and in some ways perhaps a lot less than you understand his. When he was a very young man, your father, with virtually no education, figured he'd have to find a way to buy an old truck and make a living hauling away trash for people. This was in the late 1930s, deep in the Great Depression. He could not imagine any other possibilities for himself. But then the friend of a doting and resourceful aunt finagled him a slot in a government-sponsored aircraft maintenance course at Parks Air College, not far from his hometown. It is, he says, after meeting your mother, the luckiest thing that ever happens to him in his life. It is a portal he steps through. After lunch, your father pays the tab, then steers the BMW in the direction of Washington University. This is the first couple of paragraphs from an essay called What the River Says. It's about the Salmon River, particularly the lower Salmon River. The Salmon River drainage is entirely within the state of Idaho. There are no dams on any of its many forks. It's a free-flowing wild river. What the River Says. If you were a salmon and had made your way for a couple of years in the Pacific, and had eluded predators and gill nets, and passed by several thousand brightly colored lures and flies and baited hooks, and had managed, by dint of power and tirelessness, according to some spark of memory or instinct, to get up the ladders and around the 9 dams on the Columbia and Lower Snake, and past the last slackwater reservoir at Lewiston, Idaho, you might arrive here finally where I am, at the bottom end of Hell's Canyon, at the mouth of your namesake stream. You might be here, though few of your kind make it this far, and most that do are hatchery fish, still rugged and strong, but spawned at fish factories like the ones at Rapid River near Riggins, or farther upstream across the state at Stanley Basin. If, on the other hand, you're a wild fish, you might exhibit something a little like relief here, a little like joy or even love. No one knows. You might actually sense the very pebbles you were born out of. You might hole up in one of these deep pools at the confluence of your river and the Snake. You might roll and bask, rest up a while, luxuriate in the odd primordial knowledge of your original water, then head off upstream again through the many rapids, Eye of the Needle, Snowhole, China Bar, Elkhorn, Big Mallard, Salmon Falls, all the way to the river's headwaters at Galena, and up a side creek there to a bed of sand and pea gravel, where you deposit your eggs in a red you sculpted with your tail, or if you were a male, where you'd spread your milt over that same red, fertilizing the eggs of a mate whose laying you stood guard to, and who, like you, will soon be dead and fed on by a bear or a clutch of lucky ravens. By anyone's measure, your journey is heroic, difficult in times immemorial, before dams and fisheries, before sonar and monofilament and high-tech tackle, before dewatering from irrigation and runoff of herbicides and the noxious spill from feedlots and ranches raising cattle and sheep. Your scarcity in the river named for you, wild salmon you are, is one of North America's greatest environmental shames, and the source of it all, this still beautiful river, clear and cold, a river made of many forks and tributary streams. What shall we call it when you are all gone? You survivors, you throwback anachronisms, you apparently doomed romantic symbols of human folly and contempt. When that day comes, if it comes, the river will be a monument, a tombstone, a cenotaph. And what joy we take in its beauty, its rapids, its postcard scenery, will be tempered by the elegy of your name. Thank you. Nemerov Store.